One of the top stories we have been covering so far so many times this summer, the wildfires that have broken out across various locations in the western United States. This is some new footage of the front row seat going through Sonoma County, California. It is incredibly scary to see the expansiveness of that wildfire and just going through that terrible smoke, haze, and hot fire itself. We've had some of the state's largest wildfires pop up with a couple of complexes in California this season. Not what we want to see. We often tell you about certain types of meteorologists that are called incident meteorologists. And these are meteorologists from across the country that get deployed to wildfires. And we actually are so grateful to be joined by one of those incident meteorologists right now. His name's Meteorologist Mike Ottenweller. Mike, thanks so much for your time. So, sure you get this all the time. An incident meteorologist, what is that?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Good to talk to you. So an incident meteorologist, or the short term is IMET, is a meteorologist employed by the Weather Service or a couple different agencies. And what we do is we respond wherever there's an incident. So it could be a wildfire or earthquake or a hurricane. And we respond to provide the on-site meteorology, the on-site weather support in efforts to help the team, to help the public, whoever it is that's on the ground working in that incident. We're there to give them the detailed weather forecast and whatever else they might need to make sure that they stay safe and to hopefully build the recovery efforts as fast as possible.
Okay, so an incident meteorologist for things such as earthquakes, tropical systems, fires, so that could put you anywhere in the country. I see that we have a lower third that says Alaska for you, but then you're in California, so obviously you've traveled quite a bit, and talk about that travel.
Yeah, sure. So typically we get a few days notice if it's an ongoing event. If it's an immediate emergent need, then it could be just a couple hours. But the idea is that we try to keep it as local as possible for traveling, especially with COVID. But we start out as close to the fire as we can. Of course, as we use up those resources, we go a little bit farther. So we had a lot of western region, the western half of the United States, IMETs dispatched out to wildfires and other incidents. And then eventually Alaska, was kind of in that queue, if you will. And so I got called and had a few days to prep and get ready to travel down here. So we get all of our gear ready. It's generally ready to go as it stands. And we have a standard kit that we deploy with that's got all of our tools and utilities. And then we fly or drive if we can. Generally from Alaska, that's not possible. And then we report to the scene and start to do our job as we needed.
Well, thank you for being there in California at the moment. You help out with the forecast, so talk about that. Describe what the forecasting is like for when you are working these events.
Sure. Yeah. So it's one of the chances for a meteorologist to really dial in their forecast. It's actually a really exciting opportunity. I won't say it's fun necessarily, but it's very exciting because it gives you a chance to use all the science and all the tools that you have, and you get to focus on a very specific area. So when we report to the team, we find out what the incident is. Of course, we study the terrain, the topography, we study the geography, because coming from Alaska to Northern California, it might not always be familiar to you immediately. So we learn all those things. We work with somebody called the fire behavior analyst, and that connection, that teamwork is imperative to producing a good product that helps the firefighters on the ground. But it's a chance for the meteorologist to really dial in. We get to use every tool available to us, high resolution models, satellite, radar, whatever it is that we have. We take advantage of it and really dial it in. We go on scene as close as we can get safely to the fire line to observe what the fire is doing, to look at the terrain, to try to understand where the winds are being channeled. So it's a very unique opportunity. It's a pretty awesome experience to get to go and use the science that you've learned to support somebody so intimately and hopefully, remedy the situation as fast as possible.
So I've never been that close to one of these wildfires, but is it true that some of these larger complexes of fires, they can kind of create their own little not microclimate, but their own little environment?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, yesterday, the fire behavior analyst and myself were out watching, and we were noticing how the slope winds were enhanced just because of an active burn on some of the trees. And that helped to create a more intense heat. And of course, when you have heat, it rises. And so it pulled the winds up the slope faster. In general, it was maybe 2 miles an hour, but where that active burn was happening, it was probably closer to 10. So yeah, it definitely can create it. There was some footage, I think, in the last couple days, and some of the stuff you showed of some fire whirls. And I know that those, I haven't seen one personally, but certainly those are from the localized climate that is occurring, or the micro meteorology that is occurring right there within that fire complex. Because heat, of course, is what drives weather. And anytime you add an extreme amount of heat to something, you're going to have that lift, and then, of course, produce all sorts of other variables from that localized effect.
One thing that we're watching for next week, this week and the next week, is a huge bubble of heat building in the west. Is this something you look at longer term? Do you look at the longer term weather patterns too?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you look over here, this is where we use a product that we help to brief what we call our planning team for the fire. So we have a whole section of the fire that's dedicated towards plans. And we use this to tell them what's to come in the next 7 days, because they need that information to start to think strategically about the next steps. Not only what to do for the next 24 hours, but maybe even the next couple weeks. Some of this team has been out here for several weeks now. And with that ridge of high pressure, like you talked about, and the heat that we're still expecting, they know that they probably still have a lot of work ahead of them. And so, yeah, we're absolutely looking at the Climate Prediction Center or long-range outlooks from various different models, the weather models out there, and we absolutely are keeping an eye on what's happening really for the next 24 hours, but also all the way out, I would say, as far as 30 days and maybe even longer than that when it comes to seasonal outlooks. Incident
Meteorologist Mike Ottenweller, thank you so much for not only your time with us here at WeatherNation, but also all your service there, doing us some great efforts locally. We're going to be right back here covering severe weather and the top stories. Hang tight. We'll be right back.